Alright, so gonna record part 3 of the Rip Van Winkle reading. Two things to explain. First, one, explanation of the ending of the last video, and two, an explanation of what's happening in the story so far. Explanation of the ending of part 2 of this reading is that while I was reading, Annika came home, and I wanted to be able to say hello to her when she came in the door. So I stopped the reading after the paragraph that we were on, and did that. Second thing, where are we in the story? What's going on? Well, we've met and we've been introduced to Rip Van Winkle and the town that he lives in. Rip Van Winkle is very well liked. He's also very lazy, and he and his wife, Mrs. Van Winkle, they get into these little arguments, and Rip Van Winkle goes to take a walk when that happens. And so right now, where we're picking up in the story, Rip Van Winkle is on one of those walks, and he has just been hanging out on a hillside looking out at the nature. And now he's thinking, well, I better get home so that my wife, Mrs. Van Winkle, is not mad at me. And here we go with part 3 of Rip Van Winkle. Okay. Just close that. Here we go. As he was about to descend, he heard a voice from a distance, hallooing. So right before Rip Van Winkle, he was about to leave. He was about to go down the mountain or the hillside, go home. He hears a voice shouting, Rip Van Winkle! Rip Van Winkle! He looked around but could see nothing but a crow winging its solitary flight across the mountain. He thought his fancy must have deceived him and turned again to descend when he heard the same cry ring through the still evening air. Rip Van Winkle! Rip Van Winkle! At the same time, Wolf, his dog, bristled up his back and, giving a low growl, skulked to his master's side, looking fearfully down the glen. Rip now felt a vague apprehension stealing over him. He looked anxiously in the same direction and perceived a strange figure toiling up the rocks and bending under the weight of something he carried on his back. He was surprised to see any human being in this lonely and unfrequented place, but supposing it had to be someone of the neighborhood in need of his assistance, he hastened down to yield it. On nearer approach, he was still more surprised at the singularity of the stranger's appearance. He was a short, square-built old fellow with thick, bushy hair and a grizzled beard. His dress was of the antique Dutch fashion. A cloth belt strapped round his waist, several pairs of breeches, the outer one of ample volume, decorated with rows of buttons down the sides, in bunches at the knees. He bore on his shoulders a stout container that seemed to be full of some strange drink, and made signs for Rip to approach and assist him with the container. Though rather shy and distrustful of his new acquaintance, Rip complied with his usual friendliness, and mutually helping each other out, they clambered up a narrow gully, apparently the dry bed of the mountainside. As they ascended, Rip every now and then heard long rolling peals like distant thunder that seemed to issue out of a deep ravine or rather cleft between lofty rocks toward which their rugged path led. He paused for an instant, but supposing it to be the muttering of one of those transient thunder showers which often took place in the mountain heights, he proceeded, passing through the ravine. They came to a hollow, like a small amphitheater, surrounded by perpendicular precipices, over the brinks of which impending trees shot their branches, so that you only caught glimpses of the blue sky and the bright evening cloud. During the whole time, Rip and his companion had labored on in silence, for though the former marveled greatly what could be the object of carrying this container of drink up this wild mountain, Yet there was something strange and incomprehensible about the unknown that inspired awe and checked familiarity. On entering the amphitheater, new objects of wonder presented themselves. On a level spot in the center was a company of odd-looking personages playing at ninepins. They were dressed in quaint, outlandish fashion. Some wore short doublets, other belts with long knives in their waist, and most of them had enormous breeches of similar style with that of the guides. Their visages, too, were peculiar. They had a large head, they had a large head. One of these people that Rip sees in this area that he just walked to with a stranger had a large head, a broad face, and small piggish eyes. The face of another seemed to be consistent entirely of nose and was surmounted by the white sugarloaf hat, set off with a little red feather. They all had beards of various shapes and colors. There was one who seemed to be the commander. He was a stout old gentleman with a weather-beaten countenance. He wore a laced doublet, broad belt and hanger, high-crowned hat and feather, red stockings, and high-heeled shoes with roses on them. The whole group reminded Rip of the figures in an old Flemish painting in the parlor of Dominie van Schaik, the village parson, and which had been brought over from Holland at the time of the settlement. What seemed particularly odd to Rip was that though these folks were evidently amusing themselves, they maintained the gravest faces and most mysterious silence, and were, withal, the most melancholy party of joy he had ever witnessed. Nothing interrupted the stillness of the scene but the noise of the ball, which, whenever they rolled it, echoed along the mountains like crumbling peals of thunder. As Rip and his companion approached them, they suddenly desisted from their play, and stared at him with such fixed statue-like gaze, and such strange, uncouth, lackluster countenances, that his heart turned within him, and his knees smote together. His companion now emptied the contents of the container into large cups, and made signs for Rip, to wait upon the company. He obeyed with fear and trembling. They chugged down the drink in profound silence, and then returned to their game. By degrees, Rip's awe and apprehension subsided, and even ventured, when no eye was fixed upon him, to taste the beverage, which he found had much of the flavor of excellent Hollands. He was naturally a thirsty soul, and was soon tempted to repeat the action. One taste provoked another, and he reiterated his visits to the container so often that at length he decided that he should go to sleep. On waking, he found himself on the green knoll. So he found himself in this green space, this nature area, whence he had first seen the old man of the glen, back to where he started from. He rubbed his eyes. It was a bright sunny morning. The birds were hopping and twittering among the bushes, and the eagle was wheeling aloft and going around the pure mountain breeze. Surely, Rip thought, I have not slept here all night. He recalled the occurrences before he fell asleep. The strange man with the container, the mountain ravine, the wild retreat among the rocks, the woebegone party at Ninepins. The beverage. That wicked beverage, thought Rip. What excuse shall I make to Mrs. Van Winkle? He looked round for his gun, but in place of the clean, well-oiled fowling piece, he found an old firelock lying by him, the barrel encrusted with rust, the lock falling off, and the stock worm-eaten. He now suspected that the grave roisterers of the mountain had put a trick on him, and having given him a sleeping potion, they had robbed him of his gun. Wolf too had disappeared, but he might have stayed away after the shout at. He might have strayed away after a squirrel or partridge. He whistled after him and shouted his name, but all in vain. The echoes repeated his whistle and shout, but no dog was to be seen. He determined to revisit the scene of the last evening's gamble, and if he met with any of the party, to demand his dog and gun. If he was going to go back, Rip's going to go back to where he fell asleep with all those strangers around, and then if he sees them, he's going to demand they give him back his dog and his gun, because he is assuming that he fell asleep and they robbed him. As he rose to walk, he found himself stiff in the joints and wanting in his usual activity, meaning what he's usually doing is difficult. The walking and the getting up and all that, just normal stuff for him, is difficult. These mountain beds do not agree with me, thought Rip, and if this frolic should lay me up with a fit of rheumatism, I shall have a blessed time with Mrs. Van Winkle. With some difficulty he got down into the glen. He found the gully up which he and his companion had ascended the preceding evening. But to his astonishment, a mountain stream was now foaming down it, leaping from rock to rock and filling the glen with babbling murmurs. He, however, made shift to scramble up its sides, working his toilsome way through the thickets of birch, sassafras, and witch hazel, and sometimes tripped up or entangled by the wild grapevines that twisted their coils or tendrils from tree to tree. He spread a kind of network in his path. At length he reached to where the ravine had opened through the cliffs to the amphitheater, but no traces of such opening remained. The rocks presented a high impenetrable wall, over which the torrent came tumbling in a sheet of feathery foam, and fell into a broad, deep basin, black from the shadows of the surrounding forest. So where Rip was hanging out with all those strangers, there's now a big pool of water. Where were we? Here then, poor Rip was brought to a stand. He again called and whistled after his dog. He was only answered by the cawing of a flock of idle crows, sporting high in the air about a dry tree that overhung a sunny precipice, and who, secure in their elevation, seemed to look down and scoff at the poor man's perplexities. What was to be done? The morning was passing away, and Rip felt famished for want of his breakfast. He grieved to give up his dog and gun. He dreaded to meet his wife, but it would not do to starve among the mountains. He shook his head, shouldered the rusty firelock, and with a heart full of trouble and anxiety, turned his steps homeward. As he approached the village, a couple more pages. As he approached the village, he met a number of people, but none whom he knew, which somewhat surprised him, for he thought himself acquainted with everyone in the country round. Their dress, too, was of a different fashion from that which he was accustomed. They all stared at him with equal marks of surprise, and whenever they cast their eye upon him, invariably stroked their chins. The constant recurrence of this gesture induced Rip involuntarily to do the same, when, to his astonishment, he found his beard had grown a foot long. He had now entered the skirts of the village. A troop of strange children ran at his heels, hooting after him and pointing at his gray beard. The dogs, too, not one of which he recognized for an old acquaintance, barked at him as he passed. Remember in the first reading, it said none of the dogs in the village barked at him. The very village was altered. It was larger and more populous. There were rows of houses which he had never seen before, and those which had been his familiar haunts had disappeared. Strange names were over the doors, strange faces at the windows. Everything was strange. His mind now misgave him. He began to doubt whether both he and the world around him were not bewitched. Surely this was his native village, which he had left but the day before. There stood the Catskill Mountains. There ran the Silver Hudson at a distance. There was every hill and dale precisely as it had always been. Rip was sorely perplexed. That drink last night, he thought, has addled my poor head sadly. He's all mixed up. His village has changed. It was with some difficulty that he found the way to his own house, which he approached with silent awe, expecting every moment to hear the shrill voice of Mrs. Van Winkle. He found the house gone to decay, the roof fallen in, the windows shattered, and the doors off the hinges. A half-starved dog that looked like Wolf was skulking about. Rip called him by name, but the cur snarled, showing his teeth, and passed on. This was an unkind cut, indeed. My very dog, sighed poor Rip, has forgotten me. He entered the house, which, to tell the truth, Mrs. Van Winkle had always kept in neat order. It was empty, forlorn, and apparently abandoned. This desolateness overcame all his fears. He called loudly for his wife and children. The lonely chambers rang for a moment with his voice, and then all again was silence. This video is 16 and a half minutes, so I'm going to stop here and make a new one for the rest of the reading. So where we're leaving Rip off, where we're leaving him right now is he woke up from, he was put under a magical sleep by the group of strangers in the woods, and he woke up not where he had fallen asleep at. His dog is gone, his gun is gone. He goes around the woods, he looks for those people where he had found them before, and there's a pool of water, like a little pond, nobody around. He goes to the village, and the people in the village, he doesn't recognize any of them, where before, the day before, he knew everybody in town. No dogs barked at him. Everything's different in town now. His house is destroyed. It looks like it's been abandoned for a long time. And that's where we're leaving off Rip in this part of our reading. Stay tuned for part 4.